This is the Jocko Unraveling podcast, episode 39, with Darryl Cooper and myself, Jocko Willink. The date today is October 15th, 2023. Most of the podcasts that I do are, and that you do as well, are what are termed evergreen podcasts, meaning that you can listen to them at any time and they still are relevant and make sense. The reason I'm giving the date is because I think in this situation with what's going on over in the Holy Land, things are changing very rapidly. So things that we say today may be proven or disproven or irrelevant or more relevant in 3 days or 5 days or 1 hour, depending on the way things unfold. So I just wanted to give that date. Sunday, October 15th, 2023 is when we're recording this. The war in the Holy Land. Strategic goals of Hamas. Like what? So they launch this attack. They slaughter people. They rape people. They murder people, civilians, the whole nine yards. When you think about their strategic goal, I know on the last podcast we did, I was kind of calling it a win-win for Hamas in a way. They don't do well if there's peace, right? That's not Hamas's platform. As peace was breaking out in the Middle East between the Abraham Accords, with the UAE and Bahrain, and this emerging one that it looked like was going to happen with Saudi Arabia, it seems to me like their strategic goal is just to cause chaos and mayhem, and it seems like it's working out.
Yeah, I think we can glean a little bit about their strategy from what happened back in 1996 when the Oslo Accords were being negotiated. And, on both, there was a constituency for peace and making a settlement on both sides. I think on both sides, that constituency was by far the numerically superior as they were going on. There was an absolutely huge amount of political capital in Israel, in the United States, that went in and in the Palestinians. I mean, Yasser Arafat having to swallow like a lot of his own pride and take the wrath of his own people, like really, to a large degree, including Hamas. Later on, like not long after this, there was a civil war between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And so a ton of work had gone into it, and Hamas didn't want it. Hardcore right-wing Israelis didn't want it. Both of them have maximalist goals that they don't want to compromise on, and they're willing to do whatever they have to do to make sure nobody compromises on it. And so a Jewish extremist assassinated the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin for trying to negotiate peace. Hamas blew up a couple city buses in Tel Aviv at the same intersection, in fact, in like successive weeks. And that's all it took, really. Netanyahu came to power. He was against the peace process all along. And the faction that said, hey, this is never going to work. We can't live with these people. They bomb buses like in the middle of our cities. And you want to make peace with them. Those people, maybe another year would have passed and they wouldn't have won that election. But they won the election in the aftermath of those attacks. And that's always going to be a presence that anybody who is looking to moderate and find a peaceful solution to this situation is going to have to contend with. And I don't know how you contend with it. It's very hard, Yeah,
that's when you hear the same thing in America, right? You got the far left and the far right, and that's where the problems come from. And it's the same situation you've got going on here. What about for Israel? Like, what would you say prior to this happening? It seemed like their strategic goal was to establish as much stability throughout the Middle East. I mean, life is going to be easier for them. They're prosperous. They don't want to be fighting a war. It seems like that was their strategic goal before this happened.
Yeah, no question. And actually, Netanyahu has taken criticism within Israel from politicians in the media because of a real lack of focus on Gaza and Hamas. He had sort of put it aside as not an immediate concern, not something that he came to office really like to focus on the West Bank. That's what his constituency wanted him to do. They wanted to expand the settlements, increase the number of settlements in the West Bank, and continue to focus on that. And that's where Israeli security attention has been over since Netanyahu took over about a year ago. And, Israel, I think both sides have short and long-term goals, right? And sometimes those short and long-term goals come into conflict with one another. And it definitely, you see that on the Israeli side, where short-term you have, first of all, just Netanyahu's government's domestic political situation. This happened on their watch. They could be, he's been in office for about a year now. So if you want to hold him responsible for that, it's, certainly something that his political enemies are going to do. He needs to make people forget about that, especially given he's been accused in the Israeli media and in the parliament of kind of not directly, but indirectly partnering with Hamas because they share his hostility to a two-state solution. And so how do you do that? How do Netanyahu has to go in. He has to go in hard. He has to do enough damage to Hamas that they can feel like they have some breathing room, that another attack's not going to happen next week if they leave. And also to let the Israeli people know that if they want to kill us, then people are going to pay for it.
Did you notice a little change? I noticed a little change. At least I think I noticed a change. Initial reaction from the Israeli government was, we are going to completely destroy Hamas. I believe I heard we're going to kill everyone.
Yeah, that's what they said. Every member of Hamas
is a dead man. I don't know if you've noticed recently, it's changed to, we're going to eliminate any military capability that they have. So that's a shift. Have you noticed that, or is that just me hearing what I want to hear?
No, I think that is a shift, and it's a shift toward a much more realistic goal.
Right.
Because getting rid of Hamas, it's kind of similar to when people talk about how we should go down and get rid of the cartels. It's like, well, who's a cartel member? The bosses, his main cadre of shooters and distributors, fine. Mm-hmm. But really, this is kind of a distributed network of people who, sometimes you do a job for the cartel, you courier something here and there, but really you're just some dude's nephew, and nobody would necessarily consider you a cartel member. So what are you going to do? You're going to go kill all those people? Then you're going to create a bigger problem for yourself. Because Israel's long-term strategic consideration, I think Israel's number one sort of long-term worry, right, is that the longer the occupation goes on, the longer they have this stateless refugee population on their border over whom they exercise military control and therefore are going to be held responsible for by the rest of the world, the longer that goes on, the more they run the risk of becoming the next South Africa in terms of there being a global movement to put pressure on them to change this on terms that would not be acceptable to them right now. Eventually, the South Africans had no choice. There was just so much global pressure from the West and the East during the Cold War that they had no choice but to change. And Israel runs the risk. You see in London, 50,000 people gathering in London, waving Palestinian flags. You see the same thing in European capitals, not in France. They banned all the pro-Palestine marches in France. But even in the United States, you see it. There's a lot more equivocation, a lot more than we're used to seeing after Arab attacks against Israel in the past.
Well, that's one of the biggest points that I wanted to talk about today was information operations. And in my assessment right now, even from what you just said, adds to this, the people that are winning the information operations is Hamas, and the people that are losing information operations is Israel. When you see and for people that don't know what information operations, it's probably, I don't know, I don't have the military definition on hand, but it's the all-encompassing, how are we telling the story? How are we getting our story out there? How are we propagating what's happening and propagandizing what's happening? And how are we making people understand the predicament that we're in and how we're handling it? And right now, in my assessment, Israel is not winning that information operation. And one of the things...
Which is amazing when you think about it. After what just happened,
Yep.
the extreme nature of this attack by Hamas, that already Israel is struggling to maintain control of the narrative.
Do you agree with me?
I do, yeah, especially outside the United States. The United States is always more pro-Israel than the Europeans, let alone the rest of the world. But even here, compared to previous wars and conflicts and attacks, it's turning faster than it has in the past.
It's kind of crazy to think that. It's kind of crazy to think that Hamas is winning the information operations, the information campaign. It's crazy to think that they just went and attacked Israel and murdered and killed and raped, and in a week people are, like you said, butting that, and Hamas is winning the information. That's a shock.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this real quick while it's in my head. Would the United States have been better off if, in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, where, I don't care if Noam Chomsky was president, we were kicking somebody's ass, period. But would we have been better off? The United States have been better off if, in the immediate aftermath of that, people would have said, but Al-Qaeda is justified in doing this or anything like that. But what is the United States doing over in some of these countries? Like, what did the Osama bin Laden actually say he's angry about? Why are we doing that? And having those conversations, and they're hard to have when 3,000 or 1,000 people are dead. But the problem is with Israel is a lot of the people who want to force that narrative and those questions on them. A lot of those people are just outright hostile to Israel. They're not looking for self-reflection or moderation. They're hostile. And so it is different in that sense.
Well, obviously, anytime something happens, you've got to look at yourself and see, what did I do to cause this to happen? And it's, like the people from Harvard, or the students groups from Harvard that said Israel is solely responsible for what has just happened, right? Again, you talk about some people that have some hostilities towards Israel, and that's not a self-reflective comment to say. That's just like senseless.
But let me steel man it a little bit, and I don't agree with that statement, like the Harvard student statement. But
and by the way, it wasn't the Harvard students. 31 of the people.
Right.
I don't want to group everyone Harvard together, but yeah, go ahead.
And I tweeted this out in my typically provocative way in the last several days, and got a mixed response. Some people don't like a question like this. Other people were more thoughtful about it, which is, it's a reasonable question to ask whether a stateless refugee population confined to an area ringed by a wall that is patrolled by remote-controlled machine gun robots, which Gaza is, whether the people in there can ever actually really, in a broad sense, be the aggressors against the state that put them there and keeps them there. Like, that's not an unreasonable question, in my opinion. Now, that doesn't really... It wouldn't affect my decision-making process if I was the Israeli prime minister. You have an obligation to protect and retaliate if you can't protect your people. But if you look back at, like, the United States during the frontier days, there were Indian attacks, Indian raids. They killed whole families. They mutilated corpses, all these terrible things. And those things were used to justify continued expansion and retaliation by the United States. But, like, if today the American Indian movement started bombing, shopping malls and stuff, everybody would look at that very differently than they look at Crazy Horse or somebody attacking back in the 1800s. That's them resisting the loss. I mean, we see what became of the Native Americans. They're resisting that. Nobody would really begrudge them, their right to resist that. Palestinians, it's such a unique case because, this is something that has been going on for really about 110 years now. Israel's been around since 48. And normally when, you have a successful colonization project like Israel did, and you push a lot of the people who lived in that territory out to the periphery, outside the borders of your state, that's sort of the end of the matter. Maybe a generation or two goes by, and the people who lost their homes or whatever are not around anymore, and it becomes a question for historical debate rather than a policy debate. And the Palestinians have never stopped fighting, never stopped resisting, partly because of the Arab states and the support and encouragement that they've given them. And so this is something that is really a relic of an earlier historical period that has persisted into the present day, you know?
Yeah, and I think that whole thing that you just laid out is one of the primary reasons why I think Hamas is winning the information operations, because they're going out to an audience, a global audience that is more open and receptive to this, to what the story that they're saying. And that's what they want to hear. That's what they want to believe. And it becomes really problematic. One of the things that I noticed, I woke up in the morning and a few days ago, and the lead story was Israel had killed one of the leaders of Hamas. That was the lead story. And as I went through social media and looked through, you had the couple briefings from Israel that was like, we conducted this operation, we killed this person. That's just continuing the same narrative. That message doesn't help Israel. What Israel, in my opinion, should be doing is, yes, this morning we conducted the following humanitarian operations. This morning we escorted these people to safety. This morning we provided medical care for the following Palestinian people that had come to this checkpoint that we had set up for anyone that was under medical need. Today we conducted a humanitarian operation that's what they should be doing. They're not doing that. They're reporting on, we killed this guy. We're getting ready to assault this area. We dropped this many bombs. We destroyed this. It's all about war. And what are the Palestinians replying with? Or what is Hamas? What is the social media and what is the news coming out of Hamas? All of it, they're done saying we attacked. Now they're just saying this child was killed, this woman was killed, this family was killed, here's the child buried in rubble. So there's the stories. Yeah. There's the stories that the two elements are putting out into the world. And you can see how the world is taking it. I was actually thinking, let's say, boom, everyone that's protesting in support of the Palestinians right now. And again, do I say supporting Hamas or do I say supporting the Palestinians?
It's one of those things that's difficult, right? Because if it's September 12th, 2001, and your response is to go out into the streets and protest, against U.S. involvement in the Middle East and all that kind of stuff, maybe you're not technically going out and protesting in favor of al-Qaeda, but on September 12th, 2001, that's different than if you were to do it today, And so this is an immediate aftermath.
But these folks that are going out and protesting, and that's what they're seeing in their social media feed, they're saying, yep, this is right. We're on the right side because these people are the underdog. These people are the oppressed, and therefore we should support them. What's interesting is, let's say Iran joins the war. Let's say Hezbollah goes on a full-on assault that's supported. And let's say they get the upper hand, and let's say the tables turn. And now all of a sudden it's Israeli that's on the losing end of combat. And you start to see an Israeli starts to put out, oh, yep, here's which they did for a day, right? They did for a day. There was these mass killings, and and the weird thing was they went straight to burned babies, right? Hey, this is what we're up against. And it was almost like that was a setup, okay, here's burned babies, stand by, right? Yeah. As opposed to, this is what we're living like, and this is what we've been through. It was like, this is what we're living like, this is what we've been through, so stand by. It was like immediately they went right there. So if you turn the tables and Israel started being on the losing end militarily, and their civilians were getting killed on a regular basis, what would that messaging look like? And would people start to say, oh, this has got to stop. I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe all these Arab countries are ganging up on poor little Israel. Would people flip than to support
the people who
the underdog.
I think
who would become the underdog.
The people who are currently protesting in favor of the Palestinians, probably not.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't think that they probably would, because I think there's mixed motivations. There's people who are just genuinely sympathetic toward the Palestinian cause. There's people who just don't like Israel. There's people who don't like Jews. On the other side, there's people who don't like Muslims, don't like Arabs, you know. And like, so there's a real mix of motivations that probably would lock people in. But I mean, I think if the tide turned against Israel militarily, especially if Iran was involved, we'd be at war in the Middle East, probably for sure.
And right now, Iran is making they're giving warnings. I mean, again, this is October 15th. There's been news this morning. I've been out of the loop for like 6 hours right now because I've been recording and doing other stuff. But 6 hours is a long time. But that's what, as I was coming in this morning, there was threats being made by Iran right now that, hey, if this continues, we're gonna do something. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what it is they think they can do. They can launch missiles at Israel, I suppose, but they got to know that's going to invite massive retaliation from the United States. I mean, we would definitely attack them, and then that would get really ugly, right? I mean, if you think of all of the U.S. military installations, the Baghdad embassy and so forth that are within easy reach of what I have to imagine is a massive stockpile of rockets and missiles on the Iranians' part. I mean, it would be ugly. I mean, Iran is a tough nut to crack because all the places we normally stage, like that we use, say, before the Iraq War, Kuwait, just all those places are within easy reach of Iranian missiles. You can't really come in from the east and drive across 1,000 or 1,500 miles of desert plateau before you hit a major city. And so you kind of have to go through Iraq, I guess, because Turkey probably is not going to allow us to do anything from there. And so, a lot of the people who are like, just kick Iran's ass, it's like, look, we could launch a bunch of Tomahawk missiles and stuff, but I think we've seen, people have an idea of like, you launch a bunch of missiles and it does like World War II scale damage to, military and civilian infrastructure, but it doesn't. I mean, we don't have that many of these things. And so and a real fight with Iran is a very tough thing to plan and to predict, like which way it would go.
When I was talking, just to catch up one thing, when I was talking about humanitarian operations, and like, in my opinion, if Israel wants to project a better story, they should A, conduct these humanitarian operations, B, talk about them. And some people would say, like, well, there's a huge risk to those things. And there absolutely is. There's a risk when you start to do humanitarian operations. And, the example to talk about is like in Iraq, the amount of effort that American forces went through to prevent collateral damage and to conduct humanitarian operations was crazy. Like, you're going out to, help someone build a irrigation pipeline in a city. You're out there all day. Like, you're out there, you have security, but you're going to get attacked and you might lose 2 soldiers. Like, think about that. You lose 2 soldiers that were out there helping put in an irrigation pipe. That's freaking sickening. And you might say, well, it's not worth it. Well, there's that risk is always going to be there when you conduct these type of operations. But if you ignore those things, then you just end up looking like the bad guy.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to say that these like type of humanitarian operations are without risk. They certainly would be. And I'm sure there's, a bunch of hardline Israelis hearing me say that, thinking, you're an idiot. We would never do that. These are people that just attacked us. This is why when we make decisions, we have to really look at things from a strategic picture and what we want a final outcome to be. Because, look, if you're Israel and you're like, well, I'm a hardliner and we're just going to destroy everyone. Well, first of all, that's not realistic. And second of all, where does that put you? Put you on the defensive for the next 500 years. You're watching your back for the next 500 years. There's no prosperity in the region. Like, it's just a nightmare for you. If you try and move things in a more positive direction, which sucks when the extreme organization that you're fighting against just murdered a bunch of your civilians. I know it sucks. It's freaking awful. It's terrible. Yet, if you look at things, if you detach from your emotions, and look, I'm not saying you throw your emotions away, but if you detach from them so you're not making emotional decisions, you put it in the calculus, but it should be with other factors. You shouldn't make decisions purely based on emotion. Emotion should be in there, but you've also got to think long term. You've got to think strategically where we're going to be. We got to think about the resources that we have. We got to think about all these different components that allow us to make a decision that's going to be a good decision, not just today, not just tomorrow, not just for our emotional situation, but for where we're going to be and where we want to be. So,
because basically what you're saying is you're pointing to something that people often say, which is you can do whatever you want to Gaza as long as the conditions that exist there continue to exist. Then there's gonna be more attacks. Like that is a breeding ground for violence. It doesn't matter what else you do. Like you have to actually address that problem, and it's kind of similar to like the argument of people who want to control immigration to the United States or shut down immigration to the United States. There's always you want to do something about it, and so what do you want to do? You want to build a wall, build a big like Game of Thrones wall, and keep them out. When like really, what's the only way that you could really fix illegal immigration to the United States? It's if Mexico and El Salvador and Nicaragua and all those countries, Venezuela, were actually safe and prosperous. Then that would fix the problem. But it's not an easy sell, especially, at a time like this. I'm somebody who can admit that if I was born in Gaza as an Arab, if I was born in Israel, given my natural inclinations and the conditions in which I would have been raised, I would be an extremist partisan for my side. And I can understand that. Now I try to make that have the paradoxical effect of making me less extreme in my views toward either side, because I do kind of understand that I would be on either side of this fight depending on where I was coming from.
Well, that's a good point. And as I've been thinking about, so in Gaza, and I saw a bunch of pictures of the child soldiers. They probably look like they're between 10 and 12 years old, and they're all geared up in Gaza, ready to fight. I was thinking
a little over half the population of Gaza is under 16 years old.
Right, which means they're the product of, they've been born and raised in that environment.
Yeah.
So they are going to be, I texted you a little bit about this, but there is some level of comparison with North Korea of like people in North Korea. That's what they think the world is. They think that the entire West is against them. They think that they might go to war with America tomorrow. They think like they don't have access. So Gaza has some of that going on, undoubtedly, and just like in North Korea, they're living in terrible conditions. Well, we're living in terrible conditions in Gaza. The people that are doing this over across that wall, they're living in good conditions. Why are we stuck here like this? So there is some level of comparison between North Korea and Gaza. That being said, when you have these child soldiers, just like you would look at North Korea and say, well, I understand why these North Korean soldiers are behaving the way they do. Well, I understand why these child soldiers in Gaza are looking to behave the way they're about to behave. And it's another indication that Hamas doesn't really care. I mean, Hamas has got these kids jocked up.
Yeah, they don't care about death the way we think of, at all.
Yeah, and I'll go one step further. Every Palestinian that gets killed in Gaza is a celebration for Hamas. It's a opportunity for them.
It's a tactical victory, yeah, for sure.
It's a tactical victory for them, and the younger they are and the more innocent they are, the better it is for Hamas.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody the other day who we both know, who was telling me, he's usually pretty critical of Israel, but he was talking about how his mother-in-law had a good friend, lives over in Israel, and she was down in southern Israel, and she got kidnapped and murdered, executed by Hamas during this attack. And he was going to interview another guy who takes sort of the pro-Palestinian perspective, and he was going to interview him, and he thought that he should tell him that before the interview, just to kind of be up front if he has any emotional bias or anything like that. Here's what's going on with that. And so he told him that.
So hold on, set this up for me one more time. The person that's interviewing the Palestinian?
Pro-Palestine guy. I don't know if he's Palestinian.
Okay.
Yeah. The
interviewer
mother-in-law had a friend who was murdered by Hamas.
Got it.
He told the guy, the pro-Palestine guy he was interviewing, that piece of information just so he kind of knows where he's coming from, like through the course of the conversation. And the other guy says, that's terrible. And then he tells him that his entire family had been killed the day before. Both of his grandparents, cousins, both of his parents, and all but one of his siblings, all killed by an Israeli airstrike. And the dude was like, the guy doing the interview was like, oh my gosh. And so they just didn't even bring it up during their interview. But, that's kind of the thing. Like, if you have a conflict that has been going on for basically a century with countless, just a laundry list of mass atrocities committed by both sides over the years, and nobody can seem to resolve it despite massive incentives to do that for the people involved, for foreign countries that want a feather in their cap for brokering a peace, whatever. Despite all that, you have something going on for 100 years like that. The idea that one side or the other is just solely to blame that's sort of a child's way of thinking. It's just not an adult way of looking at it. For example, like there was usually the second biggest Palestinian resistance organization over the years, ever since '67 when it was founded, is a secular socialist group called the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And it was founded by a Palestinian Christian named George Habash in 1967. And over the years, they've carried out some of the most barbaric attacks that everybody remembers from the history of this conflict, including sponsoring those Japanese terrorists who shot up the Ben Gurion airport in, 72 or something. And that guy, George Habash, was 18 or 19 years old, living in the town of Lydda with his family in 1948 when the Israeli army came in and drove them all out into the desert at gunpoint and took over that town. And just a lot of people died walking out in the desert. People call it a death march, and maybe it's not like thousands of people died. It was like probably dozens, maybe over 100, but still terrible. They were definitely like, at least on the scale of that town, you would say ethnically cleansed from that town. An army comes in, says everybody get out, and then they take it over and you're not allowed to come back. He was there, and so that guy had this happen to him and his family. 1967, he starts a terrorist organization, the PFLP. That organization carries out gruesome murders and massacres of Israelis over the years, and those dead Israelis, those people have sons and brothers and sisters, and other relatives too. And so this is, there's the cycle of violence began at a time, and I kind of touched on this earlier, but it began at a time when the world was very different than it is now. 1948, that's right after, 1948 is when the Zionist forces drove 700 to 800,000 Palestinians out of their towns and villages, pushed them out into these refugee camps where they've been sitting ever since. Massive atrocity, if that were to happen today, we would look at that as something that's totally unacceptable. This was 3 years after the Second World War. You had the Germans and Japanese, just mass violence against civilian populations. We were flattening Japanese and German cities like it was just going out of style. We had the Soviet Union was legitimized by the Allies to the point that these Soviet butchers, literally individual Soviets who had tens of thousands, had their signature on tens of thousands of murders, literally signed the papers, sat in judgment of war crimes at Nuremberg. And so, and in 1948, they were still in the process of just mass violence on an extreme level in Eastern Europe as they conquered and consolidated their control over Eastern Europe. That's what's going on in the world. In the 1950s, we killed something like 20% of the entire population of North Korea. A lot of it with heavy bombers against an enemy that didn't really have an air force of its own. So, this is the world at the time. This is how the world operates. And so in that context, I mean, shoot, 4 or 5 million Germans in Czechoslovakia and Poland and other places all got ethnically cleansed and sent packing back to Germany. And so when that's the context in which the cycle of violence starts, it's just normally this is the reason this is the way it is that it's the longest running one. It's like this. It's this callback to this earlier kind of barbaric primitive age when we were all, every country, even the good countries, were just massacring each other's civilians in war. And this one is just carried on, that cycle of violence, because after the Second World War, with the creation of the United Nations, with the Cold War considerations, the propaganda considerations of the Cold War, it became impossible for anybody, Israel in this case, to actually complete the job. If the Israelis had moved into Palestine in 1890 instead of, say 1888 instead of 1948, and done the same exact thing that they had done in 1948 and 1888, none of this would be an issue anymore. This would be something that they did at a time when that was totally normal to do, but they did this sort of, again, the UN existed. It was post-World War II. We had to worry about the Soviets saying, that the U.S. is supporting this colonization project, in the Middle East. And so it's prevented the Israelis from ever actually going in and doing anything that would finish the job, which I'm not endorsing that. That's a horrific thing. Like, it's just all these things I'm talking about in the past were horrible, but they resolved the issue. Japan stopped being a problem. Germany stopped being a problem. And we were able to move on. And that's coming from somebody who's very critical of a lot of the stuff that even the Allies did in the Second World War, the strategic bombing campaigns and everything else. I'm very critical of that stuff. But in the aftermath of that war, we were able to be friends with Germany again. We were able to move on. And Israel has never been able to do that because this whole conflict, it started in the old world, but it's taken place almost entirely in the new world where none of those things are really allowed to happen anymore.
What is it then that is it the fact that the Palestinians that got, removed from Israel, they didn't have anywhere to go? Is it like why would you say that this is different other than the time frame that it lasted? Because, I've always said, I used to say this about, Germany and Japan, like we needed to stay there for a couple generations, and then a couple generations goes by, and now you're like, okay, then people have now seen that this is the way it's going to be now, and you kind of move past it. I said that about Iraq. I said it's going to take a couple generations. We didn't stay there, but if you really want, the dream of this having this sort of democratic type country over there with peace and prosperity, I used to say, hey, it's going to take a couple generations. It's going to take a couple generations. When people see, oh, I understand the way that this Western style of living works, because they don't understand it at first. It's totally different. The classic example I use is, the officers would take money from their soldiers. They'd skim their paychecks. We all think that's crazy. We would talk to them about it and be like, well, of course my boss is going to take some of our money. That's the way the world works. So to get rid of that corruption would take a couple generations, because the people that grew up that way and probably their kids aren't going to process a totally new way of living.
Yeah.
And so where, how has this history sustained itself from generation to generation to generation to generation?
So,
four or five generations deep?
So a huge part of it is that Palestine has always been used by the Arab country, or now the Muslim countries in the Middle East, as a means for Arab leaders to, and now the Ayatollah, to bolster their own reputation throughout the region, as I'm the one who's going to stand up to the Zionists finally, after they humiliated us in 1948, they humiliated us in 1967. The whole world's on their side. I'm going to stand up to them. This is why Nasser was so popular. It's why, you would think, okay, Iran, this is a Persian country. you got Iraq and Syria between Israel and it. It's way over there. Why is Israel like such a focus for them? And part of it is, fine, I'm sure there's like a certain level of Muslim solidarity or whatever, but there's political calculations going on here, and they understand that it is one of those issues that they can rally people around and that they can use to delegitimize their rivals in the region, like their other Arab and Muslim rivals in the region, for not being sufficiently strong on the issue. And that is always happening. So, people bring up even still today, they say, well, why didn't Egypt just absorb the people of Gaza? They're just Arabs. They're, Palestinians, okay, fine, but that's like 100 years old, really, that was a national identity anybody took seriously. Why didn't the ones in Gaza just go become Egyptians? The ones in the West Bank and Jordan just go become Jordanians and Syrians and Lebanese and so forth? And if this had all happened in 1888, that's exactly what would have happened. But you run into this problem where once the ethnogenesis takes place, once you have this group of people who are it's kind of like, it's very similar to like the argument Putin tries to put out about Ukraine. Like, oh, this is not, like 100 years ago, these people all considered themselves Russians. This is all a modern invention. This is like a legacy of the Soviet stuff. This is not real. These people are Russian. And the thing is, like, all of Putin's historical takes on that might be correct, but it doesn't matter because they're there now. And once they're there now and that ethnogenesis has taken place and that collective identity solidified, it's not going anywhere.
So it became like a rallying cry.
100%.
That's now that you're kind of talking through that, to me, that's the word that comes to mind, is that for all these years, it's become a rallying cry for the Islamic world primarily to say, look, there's no easier way to unify people than to point at a bad guy or point at a positive goal, right? You've got a bunch of people that are kind of, you work at a company and there's a bunch of people with a bunch of different things going on and no one's really focusing. You say, hey, you know what? We're Ford and we're going to race against Ferrari, right? And we're going to beat them. Like, that's a unifying thing to do. Well, that's a great way to unify a bunch of people is, hey, we lost a couple wars. We lost a bunch of land. We're going to get it back and bring that up over and over again. It's a nightmare.
And, in a lot of these countries, the Arab street is more extreme on this issue than their own leaders. And so, you look at a place like Jordan, you look at a place like Saudi Arabia, even now that Mohammed bin Salman's in there, Egypt. These are all countries that are perfectly capable of coexisting with Israel. But they are sitting, they're ruling over populations that have different views on that question, sometimes. And I mean, one of the things that's absolutely needed is leadership in those countries, leadership that can actually lead their populations down in that direction. But go ahead.
Well, I think one of the really kind of just things where Israel wins is, as we pointed out in the beginning, like Israel's goal is peace and stability and security and to unify with or work alongside as many people as we can and like let's move forward. And that's why I think, again, when we look at what's happening right now, okay, it seems like what Israel wants would be a nice thing. and to me, that's sort of like the most positive way to look at it.
But it's kind of similar, though, to like the Russians right now have control of Donbass. They have control of Crimea. They're in the process of taking over more. And the Russians would say, look, we just want peace. Stop fighting, Ukrainians. Why are you still fighting? We're ready to negotiate right now and just end this whole thing. Oh, no, we're not giving back Crimea. Let's not get carried away, or that's ours. And so for so from a certain perspective, you could look at it and say, well, it's the Ukrainians are the ones responsible for carrying on this conflict. The Russians are ready to kind of stop things where they are and let it sit. The Ukrainians aren't willing to accept that. So aren't they the ones responsible for this conflict, even though they were the ones that got invaded, right? Because there's these two questions that have obvious answers, and yet those obvious answers completely contradict one another in terms of how they get applied practically. One is, does the Israeli government have a right and responsibility to defend its own people and to retaliate when they're attacked? Of course. Like, that's just an obvious, it's almost a non sequitur. Of course they do. Should the Palestinians just sort of accept that they lost their homeland and that's that? Or do they have a right to resist? And that's kind of got an obvious answer too, in the sense of surely they have a right. They're not like, the moral balance is not completely tipped against them if they want to continue to resist what has happened. A lot of these towns down in southern Israel that just got attacked by Hamas, Ashkelon is the sort of most well-known one right there on the southern coast. Those were, up until 1948, those were fully Palestinian towns. And those people all got driven out, and their grandkids and great-grandkids live in refugee camps in these places, administered by the UN, living off of, aid from the UN and from other countries, drinking, their water out of those little bags, like everything else. And if you're a young Arab dude, a young Palestinian, and you look around you and you see your grandmother and your grandfather and your mother and your sisters and brothers, and they're all living in this cinder block and tin shanty, and the town that they were driven out of, in fact, the house is still standing. It's right over there. It's 5 miles away. It's 10 miles away, like on the other side of that wall around Gaza that's patrolled by the machine gun robots. You can't go get her house back, but you can go burn that house down. And that's kind of been the mentality of the Palestinians for a long time, which is, and I mean, me, like I try to have like what I would call like a nuanced view on the situation. Other people say it's kind of relativist or whatever, and I accept that it comes across that way, certainly in the aftermath of an attack like just happened. And so, if you're like a hardcore pro-Israel person, a lot of people read my tweets and see my takes on it, and they think I'm way too pro-Palestine, too sympathetic to them, and that's fine. I get that. But I'm the first one to admit that for a long time now, the Palestinian resistance has really been like a nihilistic, violent, just we talk about Hamas's long-term strategic goals. It's not that they exactly have none, but I really think that they're secondary considerations. They want to hurt and kill the people that have continued to keep them in this humiliating position. That's the way they see it. And what's the long-term plan with that? It's like sometimes, if you're living in a place like Gaza where, like, what's your best case scenario for your future is pretty shitty, as far as how your life's going to go. You make very short-term calculations that override everything else. And it's been that way for a long time now. It really has. I mean, I would say at least since, you could argue it's been like this since before the 48 war, but definitely like the official Palestine resistance organizations, how they, if you go back to like the 50s and 60s, you would have Palestinians like that dude who can't go get his grandma's house back, but he can burn that house down. Those kind of raids would happen. There would be killings and sabotage and things by individual little groups of friends or something. But as far as the Palestine resistance organizations, up through the 50s and really until the late 60s even, for the most part, I would say mid-60s, they were focused on attacking Israeli military checkpoints, ambushing soldiers on patrol. It was a military situation. And when you got into the 1970s, that all changed. And they just started engaging in the kind of terrorism that we've become used to now, just mass killing of civilians. Find the softest possible target, kill as many people as you can, and then die. And when that's what any resistance movement or just any kind of movement has been reduced to, man, it's really hard to keep any of their historical claims or grievances in mind for very long.
Yeah.
Well,
that's where I think if you look at from that perspective over that time period, that's when they were completely losing the information operations, because They were doing these things. I think the way you described it is nihilistic. That's a great way to describe it. And people look on them from the outside. So I'm like, wait a second, you just killed a bunch of women and kids. You blew up a bus. You blew up a school. You invaded school. Like, all those things they're suicidal, not just suicidal for the individuals that execute, but it's like borderline suicidal for the movement. And they did nothing during that time frame to gain popular support across globally, right? And it's only now, again, that's why it surprises me to see Hamas sort of winning the information operations. But, what if they would have had a Gandhi leader, a Martin Luther King leader, and they took that approach during the late 1960s?
Yeah, you don't know, right? Because Gandhi's tactics would not have worked on the Mongols. The question of whether, because the thing is like, when you get down to it, and this is just sort of the unfortunate and dark reality of the situation, is that both sides have claims that look justifiable from their own perspective, 100% righteous and justifiable, that are just absolutely mutually exclusive. Like there is no settlement that is even being remotely discussed before this attack, that's even being remotely discussed in Israel, that is remotely acceptable to the Palestinians, that the Palestinians don't see as just ratifying their own ethnic cleansing and saying everything that's happened to us in the years since then, that's all water under the bridge, and we're just going to sort of accept the scraps that we can get. There's no settlement on offer that doesn't look that way to them. There is no settlement on offer, even from the moderate Palestinian people, that is remotely acceptable to even like the Israeli liberals. Because, you think about, like, people talk about a one-state or a two-state solution, right? One-state solution is basically the idea that, like if you go back to the American Civil War, like before and just after it, there were a lot of people in the United States, including abolitionists, people who hated slavery, who wanted the slaves all freed, but they weren't remotely even thinking about bringing the slaves in as citizens, allowing them to vote in our democratic system or anything like that. They didn't, and they had all these like outlandish plans for how to repatriate them to Africa or settle them off in Central America or something. But but what ended up happening, like the thing that kind of the argument that won the day, is like, these people are probably going to be angry at us for a long time. You enslaved them, you kidnapped them from their home, all these kind of things. And that is it's going to be hard to integrate them successfully into your society as citizens. Like, there's going to be difficulties there, no doubt about it. But you broke it, you bought it. Like, these people are your responsibility, whether you like it or not. And there are people who will say, look at, Israel was formed in 1948. The 1967 war, that's 19 years into Israel's existence. That's the period of time that the Palestinians were not living under Israeli military occupation. So they've been under Israeli occupation for 3 times as long as they weren't under it. And there's people that look at it and say, look, you can say these people aren't Israelis, but you've been making decisions for them and controlling, their towns and cities and their physical security for 3 times longer than they ever lived without that. And so these people are yours, like whether you like it or not. Make them Israeli citizens and let them participate, give them civil rights. Now, of course, the problem with that is if you did that, overnight, the population of Israel, the Jewish population of Israel, goes down to about 45 or 50%. And it's unrealistic in the extreme to expect that everybody is just going to wake up the next day and sort of be liberal individualists who don't vote in accordance with their identity group. And so the one-state solution would force the choice on Israel. Do you want to stay a democracy or do you want to stay a Jewish state? Because those two things would become mutually exclusive, which means that the one-state solution is not going to happen. The two-state solution is a little more straightforward and simple in the sense that it's just, okay, the Palestinians are all in the West Bank in Gaza. we would have to figure out how to connect those two places, maybe like a highway network or something. And that's, there's some difficulty there, maybe some geographic concessions in the desert down there in the south. But let it be another country. Let it be its own state with a UN seat and all these kind of things. And there have been, over the years, a lot of like Israeli right-wingers who have been in favor of this because they look at it as an easier problem to deal with. Mm-hmm. If you have a foreign state over here with an army and embassies in capitals around the world, and they're sponsoring terrorist attacks against your civilians, you have a different range of options available to you than if this is a sort of refugee population that doesn't have a state, that you're in control of militarily, and it just gives you a wider range of options. Not to mention the fact that, and people made this argument when Hamas took over Gaza, Israelis, they were like, there were some people who were like, we can't let Hamas take over Gaza. This is crazy. They're terrorists.
And other people, just to clarify, this is what you're talking about when Gaza got voted into power in Gaza.
Yeah, and
when Hamas got voted.
And I don't know really the details of how that vote went down, and whether it's people were intimidated or what. I actually don't know much about that. I should probably look more into it. But Hamas was voted in 2006. That was the last election that was ever held, though. And there were Israelis at the time who were like, we can't let Hamas become the government in Gaza. It's insane. These people are terrorists. They're murderers. But there are other people, even people further to the right of the first ones, who said, well, wait a second here. Hamas is a lot easier to find if they're in the headquarters building over there, and that's their communications building, and this is their military training. That's a lot easier to deal with. We know where to find them. We know how to deal with that a little bit better than we do this sort of weird insurgency situation where and so, I mean, you go back even to 1967, David Ben-Gurion, who was the leader of the Zionist movement for decades leading up to that point, when the Israelis took over the West Bank and Gaza from Egypt and Jordan, he was like, give it back. Give it back. Are you crazy? Like, we don't want millions of Palestinians that now we are going to be responsible for. And whether we like it or not, the world's going to look at us and be like, well, look, you have if you have military patrols going through their towns and villages, you're responsible for those people, whether you like it or not. And that is what has kind of happened. And, the two-state solution, there's a problem with that one too, though, unfortunately, which is that, there are about 450,000 Israeli settlers scattered in communities throughout the West Bank. Over 100 of those communities are illegal, even according to Israeli law. Mm-hmm. But there's no political will, there's no political faction in Israel that has the will or the power to repatriate those people. And they're scattered into places that really break up the contiguity of any prospective Palestinian state. And so these people would either end up as a minority in a Palestinian state, Jewish minority in a Palestinian state, which is not something anybody would be prepared to tolerate, at least right now, or they would have to go back. And in the past couple decades, when Israel has tried to just evacuate a few hundred settlers, Israeli settlers, from places that were, that one of the illegal settlements, but one that was causing a particular problem in their dealings with the Palestinian Authority, just a few hundred people they tried to move out. And there were riots across the settlements. They were fighting Israeli security forces. It got pretty ugly. And so you're going to do that to 450,000 people? No, you're not. It's just not going to happen. And so, the one and two state solutions are they're really just, they both would force one side or the other, or both sides, to accept things that there's no way they could accept. You just couldn't. And you always come back to just the same thing we said earlier, though, right? Which is, okay, so if the situation remains as it is, look, and the Israelis are pretty hard-eyed and clear-eyed about this stuff. There's a reason Israeli leaders have called their periodic assaults on Gaza mowing the lawn. They don't really expect it to accomplish anything. You just have to go in there occasionally and mow the lawn. They attack us, you got to go hit them back, just to maintain the legitimacy of the Israeli state and to establish at least some level of deterrence among the people who aren't already completely captured by Hamas ideology, but not with an idea that it really accomplishes anything long term.
So, it's really hard to figure out a way that this goes.
Can I run something by you?
Yeah.
Because I don't know exactly how I feel about this, but maybe as I lay it out, my feelings about it will firm up, or maybe not. People have looked at these videos that have come out of people in Gaza, people on the street, celebrating around the corpse of an Israeli woman. There was one being paraded around. There's videos like of after Israeli attacks just in the past of Palestinians celebrating on the street. And people point to that as a sort of justification for a sense of collective responsibility on these people. They voted in Hamas. They cheer on these attacks. They might not have carried them out, but there's no reason that we should be real squeamish about any attacks that happen to kill those people, because look at them. They're celebrating these attacks. The other side's argument, they would look and say, okay, back in 1948, as the war was going on, there was a group called the Stern Gang. Lehi, they called it in Hebrew. This was a straight-up terrorist organization that sent mail bombs to British officials in London, may have sent mail bombs to Harry Truman. There's some evidence that took place, although I've only seen it in two places. There was the guy who ran the mailroom at the White House for 6 presidents wrote a memoir about what that was like, and he was there during Truman, and he said that they had received mail bombs addressed to Truman from this Zionist group. And then Harry Truman's daughter wrote in her memoir that had happened, but she might have been citing the other guy, so I don't know. But still, a hardcore group of people. They planted bombs in marketplaces that massacred hundreds of Palestinians. In 1948, a group of them went into a village called Deir Yassin and massacred everybody there. It was a My Lai massacre kind of thing. All the men were gone. All the military-age men were gone because they were involved in the fighting somewhere, and they just came and massacred all the women and children. And this is something that Israeli historians have written about, and it's not really controversial anymore about what happened. It was a My Lai-style massacre that was carried out by this group, the Stern Gang, or Lehi. Well, Lehi is still a recognized medal in the Israeli Defense Forces. So is Irgun, which is another major terrorist organization, Zionist terrorist organization that existed back then. The leader of that group, when the Deir Yassin massacre was carried out in 1948, was Yitzhak Shamir, who was later elected Prime Minister of Israel. The leader of Irgun, the other terrorist organization that killed huge numbers of civilians, killed a lot of British personnel as well, including carrying out the King David Hotel bombing, which is where the British used as their headquarters. The leader of that group was Menachem Begin. He was later elected Israeli Prime Minister. You take a guy like Ariel Sharon, who, all hyperbole aside, I mean, Ariel Sharon is like a real deal 20th century war criminal. And there's a lot of Israeli high officials, including military people who were in the government with him, who think that. You go back to like 1981. The Israeli defense minister, Ben-Gal, was being accused by some of his own high officials of in signing off on killings of civilians, and so he got run out of office. And Menachem Begin was prime minister at the time, and he was kind of old and senile. A lot of people say he was kind of like it was a Biden situation where he's just sort of checked out, and that gave the people in his government a lot of room to kind of operate on their own. And so he replaces the defense minister with Ariel Sharon. And right away, Ariel Sharon wanted to go to war with Lebanon. That's what he wanted to happen, because that's where all of after 1970, that's where most of the Palestinian leadership was. They had been in Jordan, but after Black September in 1970, the Jordanians ran them out. They all went to Lebanon. And so Ariel Sharon wants to go to war with Lebanon. And he essentially works with IDF Northern Command and just goes rogue. He's literally working with IDF Northern Command and special operations groups up there. And Bergman writes about this in that book you gave me, Rise and Kill First, where They killed hundreds of civilians with car bombs, donkey bombs, other IEDs that they placed around that were built in Israeli Special Operations headquarters, or not the central headquarters in Tel Aviv, but up there in Northern Command. They were building these bombs, getting locals to, paying them to go plant them in areas with the specific goal. And again, there's enough high Israeli officials and military officials from that time who are critical of what Sharon was doing that we've kind of got the full story on it now, that his goal was to ignite a civil war between the Lebanese Christians, the Shiites, and the Palestinians. And so he would bomb the Shiites and the Christians and try to make it look like it was the Palestinians. He would bomb Palestinians, try to make it look like it was the Shiites or the Christians to get them going. And I mean, one car bomb killed 83 civilians, wounded another 300. A lot of the people who were killed were women who worked in a clothing factory that all burned to death. And there were hundreds and hundreds, minimum hundreds of people who were killed in these straightforward terrorist attacks, right? He gets his way, though. They do invade Lebanon after some things kick off. It was actually, this is his funny story, actually. Bergman writes how as all these terrorist attacks were going on, Arafat and his people had actually figured out what was happening, and they were putting out word on the street to the groups they controlled, don't take the bait. Like, they want to invade us. These are there to provoke us. Don't take the bait. And that worked for a while, but then this kind of lone Palestinian gunman up in London killed the Israeli ambassador as he was coming out of an event there in London. And then that became the reason that allowed, what is it? Casus Belli, yeah, for Israel. And so they went in and they invade Lebanon. And the entire time as the Lebanese war is progressing, Sharon is just straight up lying to Begin, the prime minister, and the rest of the government. He's like, okay, yeah, all I'm doing, establishing a security perimeter right here in like this little part of southern Lebanon. We just got to push these people out because they're launching, rockets or mortars at our troops. We're going to do that. And he would push out past that. And he'd say, well, now we have to, it was just a mission creep, but it was done very consciously. And so that they went all the way up to Beirut. When they were in control of Beirut, there's the famous massacres that took place at Sabra and Shatila, which are two Palestinian refugee camps where the Israeli Defense Forces were in control of the area, and one of the Christian militias in Lebanon that they were allied to went in there under the watch, and we know now with the knowledge of a lot of the people, they didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but they knew there was going to be a massacre, and they let them go in, and they killed 1,000, maybe 1,500 Palestinian civilians, women and children, massacred them, cut them up, mutilated them. It was a horrible war crime. So that happens. They call Ariel Sharon the butcher of Beirut. Every Palestinian calls him that. All of these stories that most Americans don't know, that most Israeli kids don't learn about, every single Palestinian knows all of these stories and all the rest, right? And so they would look at it and be like, this guy, the butcher of Beirut, you elected him prime minister. And so, yeah, there's videos of Palestinians cheering after an Israeli attack. You elected this terrorist as your prime minister. And so how is that not the same thing? Is that a similar thing? Do one or neither or both of those perspectives have any validity?
Well, therein lies the problem, right? Therein lies the problem that the way people are educated, the what they learn, what gets propagated, it makes people believe and think a certain way. And if you've got two groups of people that have been raised and educated to think a certain way, they're not going to come to agreement on much. And this is what's so terrible about the situation is, even the last one we posted, I said something like no answers, no answers, because there's a lot of people that are pontificating about what the right thing to do is. And really what, unfortunately, I always like to think of, okay, how do we, what do we do? What's the minimum amount of military activity that we can move forward with and find a solution? Like, how can we do this with compromise? How can we do this with forgiveness? How can we do this with humanitarian attitudes? How can we move forward in the most peaceful possible way? And again, the last podcast we did about this, I started off with, blood meridian. And this is where I end up. Because at this juncture, again, with the attitudes the way they are, with the beliefs the way they are, with the history the way it is going, I don't think I can conceive of a solution that is even remotely peaceful, or even remotely, that even has any real sort of iota of compromise in it. It just really seems like that's where we're at. And I would say that, again, I believe that the Israelis, at least at this juncture in history, would like to create peace and prosperity, but it doesn't seem like they are going to be allowed to do that. And the nihilistic nature of Hamas, why you can just come down with me, and I'm going to take whatever I can, and I'm going to burn, the house that my grandma lived in over in that village. I know I can't live there, but I'm going to burn it down.
And that's good enough.
And that's good enough. And that is I like to talk about de-escalation. I like to talk about forgiveness. I like to talk about let's put history in perspective, but let's not live in history. Let's use history as a way to understand each other, not as a way to form more animosity. And you can see at this juncture, it just doesn't seem like this is what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's a tough situation, right? Like, you think of imagine a person is in a third floor window of a burning building, and they got to jump out of the window or they're going to die. And so they jump out and they land on somebody, and now they're on top of them. And this person who just got landed on is not happy about it. And he's saying, get off me. And then the guy on bottom pulls a knife. He's like, get off me, I'm going to kill you. Well, now the guy on top says, well, I can't get off this guy. That would be suicide. I can't get off him. I have to stay on him. And that goes on for a long time. That's really kind of the situation that you could, it's an analogy I think that works for what happened in Israel and Palestine. The Jews had to find a place to live. The lesson of the 40s, of the Jews in the 40s, and the Palestinians since then, for that matter, is that every people needs a state. Every people needs a state that is dedicated to their well-being, or else you are going to be vulnerable to abuse by peoples who do have states and can engage in high politics like that. And so, they needed a place to live, and they went to Palestine. They colonized that place, and that, the Palestinians themselves would put it this way about how, they back in the 40s and 50s, they're like, we didn't do the Holocaust. We didn't have anything to do with that. Like, you're punishing us, like all you European countries in the UN General Assembly that just voted to partition our country and give, half of it to the Zionists. Give them part of Germany. Like, who are you kidding? Like, we have nothing to do with this whole thing that's going on, and yet it's all falling on us. And that's all true. I mean, I think that's all true. The Palestinians, the Jews were in an impossible situation in Europe. They needed somewhere to go. What was done to the Palestinians in the process of that was it was a one-sided atrocity. I mean, these people lost their homes. They lost their towns and villages that they had lived in for a long time and herded into refugee camps. And that's terrible. But at a certain point, when that guy on bottom has pulled a knife and he's saying, as soon as you let me up, as soon as I have an opportunity, I'm going to cut your throat, especially if your kids are right there next to you and everything, you can't let that guy up. And I don't know how you do that. Like, we all had that experience on a small scale with our little brothers or little cousins or something, right? Like, you're holding them down, messing with them, and they're like, let me up. They're just losing their minds. You're like, I'll let you up if you stop fighting. Let you up if you stop. I'm not going to stop fighting. Get off me. It's like, I'm not going to let you up. And you just have to wear them down. And it's a similar situation in a lot of ways. I shouldn't be laughing. I mean, but it's an impossible situation for both sides. Any Palestinian that tries to compromise along lines that would be acceptable to the Israelis, especially in this political environment, is going to get killed by Hamas or somebody else. And he's literally going to be killed. And anything that would be that would be acceptable to Palestinians under those conditions is just, it's not even that there's no political will for it in Israel. It's that it would fatally compromise Israel as a Jewish state. It just wouldn't be able to remain what it is. It's just the long term, if we look 500 years down the line, one of two things is going to happen. Is either the Arabs are going to demographically swamp the Israelis. They have a lot more babies. Technology is going to continue to develop so that we can make all these deals so that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, or that some terrorist group can't get nuclear weapons or something for a while. But in 500 years, can we do that? Like the entire, for the entire time during that? Maybe not. So that's one direction that this goes. Horrifying. The other direction is that the Palestinian people, as a collective identity group, as a people who is a self-conscious group, Palestinians, we are Palestinian Arabs, that essentially goes away, and those people become Egyptians, they become Jordanians and Syrians. And maybe they still have a sort of ethnic identity in those places, so that there's Mexican Americans, there's Palestinian Egyptians and stuff, but that whole dream of having an independent Palestine goes away. And if you're a Palestinian whose grandma was driven out of that home in Ashkelon, that's a really ugly future too. So,
I always try and advise people to take the high ground, and not only on the battlefield, but more important in life and in these political situations. And I think that will be beneficial over the near term for people to try and take the high ground, the moral high ground about what's happening. Again, that's why I talk about humanitarian efforts. That's why I talk about trying to find some level of compromise. If you're not doing those things, you're going to be perpetually putting yourself in a worse and worse. You're giving yourself less and less leverage to maneuver, and that's not going to work out well. I know you reached out on Twitter X and hit up some, if anybody had any questions. I know we're probably out of time right now, but any couple of them that you want to hit real quick?
Yeah, and we don't have to do them all now. I'm sure this conflict's gonna evolve very quickly, and we'll talk about it again. One of the questions that I thought was relevant to both of us and our sort of narrow range of expertise, being Navy guys, is we've seen in recent days that the U.S. is ordering second, I think maybe a third, but certainly at least 2 carrier strike groups to the region. What is the purpose of that? Somebody asks. What's the thinking of the people who are ordering that move? What purpose could it serve, and what are the risks of having that thing over there at a time like this?
Well, clearly, just out of the gate, it's a show of support and a show of strength for Israel. That's out of the gate. It's also sort of like showing up, at the laser tag. The laser tag, what do they call them? Jim? What do they call a laser tag place? The laser tag place, and you've got like a Mark 48 machine gun. Yeah. Are you really going to be able to utilize this in a way that makes sense? you're going to go play laser tag and you start mowing people down with the Mark 48 machine gun. That's so sure. Guess what? Hopefully the people that are playing laser tag are like, okay, dude, we get it. Like, we'll settle down. We don't really want you in the game. So there's some of that going on. But again, when you've got sides that don't really feel like settling down, it's going to be a problem.
Yeah. It does raise the risk of something happening that could dramatically escalate the conflict, right? And get us involved in a way that maybe we don't want to be. Back in 2006, during the Israeli war with Hezbollah, Hezbollah launched an anti-ship missile and hit an Israeli frigate. They have demonstrated that capability. I assume they've probably got more and better weapons now than they did then. I know the Houthis launched a couple missiles at U.S. ships passing by Yemen there. I would despair to think about what would happen if we had one of our carriers over there and it got shot by a missile by anybody, by Iran or Hezbollah or anything like that. It's
I would strongly advise, if you're listening to this podcast and you have any influence, don't shoot anything at American aircraft carriers, and it'll be really problematic for you and the rest of the world. And like that's I'm not kidding. That's just not going to work out well.
For one, it's not going to accomplish anything. Just so you know, carriers are damn near impossible to sink. Modern carriers, your little off-brand Charlie 802 anti-ship missiles, not going to do it. You're just going to be a pain in the ass, and we are going to destroy you and everybody you know. So don't do that.
All right. What's another question?
What would you? Yeah, we've kind of addressed this a little bit, but let's just sort of lay it out there. You're not even the Israeli prime minister. You are the king of Israel, or maybe we're not going to use that term. You're the emperor of Israel. You've got total God mode powers over Israeli policy. Something like this happens in the historical context that we're currently in, everything as it is now. What do you do?
Well, I think the immediate reaction that Israel executed on, which was like securing the fences, that immediate military action that they took was really good. It was a good, solid military action that they took quickly. At this juncture, I think it's going to be, and I think I would, like you said, I already kind of said what I'd be doing. I would probably stop bombing Gaza right now. There's people in tunnels. The enemy's, you're not killing bad guys at this juncture with airstrikes. So what you're doing is just destroying the city, and you're giving Hamas opportunities to win the information operations. If I was emperor of Israel right now, we would be annihilating on the information operations. We would be doing humanitarian missions. We would be showing and doing things that would show the world what our attitude was, and that we weren't the aggressors here, and that we were going to try and do our best. And I would also be showing that to the Palestinians as well, that they need to see, like, oh, there's opportunity out here. And I know that they have, they had work programs where the Palestinians could go out and work in Israel. I would have expanded that. I mean, right now it's really difficult. But, okay, well, if you go through these metal detectors and you show up here and we know who you are, you can go to work out here every day. And as a matter of fact, you can live out here. We can set you up. So I would start really trying to take care of the Palestinian people, trying to show them goodwill, trying to take care of the civilians in the highest possible way that I could. And then I would go and execute missions where we eliminate Hamas. And that's what I would do.
When before we started recording, you showed me a video of the aftermath of some strikes on Hamas. Yep. It was just, a wasteland. And the first thing I thought, whenever I see something like that, as somebody who has combat experience as a soldier, when you see a landscape like that, knowing that there's tunnels throughout the area and everything, what are you thinking when you look at that?
It's a nightmare. And that's why, like, even, again, going to the emperor position, I would not be super excited to roll in there and start hunting for Hamas with my troops. I'm going to take a lot of casualties. I'm going to take a ton of... You want to start talking about clearing, what do they say, 300 miles of tunnels is what's what's down there? 300 miles
Booby
of
traps.
tunnels. 300 miles of tunnels. This to me turns into siege warfare. And I start doing siege warfare with this overarching idea of benevolence to take care of the civilian populace and show them that we will help. We are here. We want to figure out a peaceful solution to this. We're going to help you out, and we're going to starve and crush Hamas. And you don't want to get starved and crushed? Cool. Come to this location at this time. We'll give you food and water. We'll help you to the best of our ability. We'll give you medical support. We're going to go in. We're going to secure, because I'm not going to secure all of Gaza, but we can secure this area. Now we can have checkpoints going into there where we can start normalizing life there. Start showing people the better opportunity that is out there besides the nihilistic Hamas way forward. That's what I would do. I would really, and look, I know that this sucks. And you want to know why I know this sucks? Because when my guys got killed, we had to still continue to work with the civilian populace. We had to go and try and help them build projects out in the city. We had to put our guys at risk to conduct civil affairs operations. And I know it sucks, but that is how you actually get the other side to see your perspective a little bit as well.
I mean, to the first thing that has to happen if you're going to win those hearts and minds, though, right, is you have to destroy Hamas. Just like when you were in Ramadi, you could drill all the wells and do all the things you wanted. None of that matters if you don't kill the jihadists in that city, right?
The thing is, you said first you have to do this. It's going to be a simultaneous operation because if you focus only on killing Hamas right now and you don't do anything humanitarian to support prior to, you're going to kill everybody, or you're going to at least starve everybody, or there's going to be real problems. So it has to be a simultaneous lines of operations that you're executing at the same time. And look, from a political perspective, it's going to be challenging, but you have to explain to the team, just like I had to explain to young freaking SEALs that work for me, hey, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is why this is beneficial. This is why this is going to help us strategically in the long run. That's what the government of Israel is going to have to.
And it would probably take somebody like Netanyahu to do that, right? Because nobody's going to look at Netanyahu and be like, oh, he's soft on the Palestinians.
Right. He's in a good position to be able, just like I was in a good position to do that. I was an aggressive leader and, very aggressive doing combat operations. So when I explained, hey, we're also going to do these operations, the guys weren't like, oh, no, he's weak. No, it's like we're actually conducting what is all the lines of operation in counterinsurgency warfare. And this is what our job is. So when guys understand that, and that's what the civilian populace of Israel, and again, are there going to be some hardcore that are going to be like, this is bullshit. I don't want to risk my life. I don't want to put one penny towards humanitarian efforts. They voted for Hamas. They supported, they cheered in the streets. You cannot, we as in leadership positions, you have to be balanced and you have to help pull people into a more balanced position. That's what your goal is. So in a leadership position, the mob is going to be moving. And when the mob starts moving in the wrong direction, you're the one that has to pull it back center. And if you get caught up in the mob or you support the mob, they're just going to fly off the handle. So you're the one. And look, the mob might be too aggressive. They might be not aggressive enough. If in a different world, it may be like, well, we can understand why this happened, and we just kind of have to accept the fact that if Hamas feels this aggravated, they should have the right to come and kill. Like, that would be obviously too far.
It's like the London mayor said, these kinds of, after the Ariana Grande concert, he said, well, terrorist attacks like this are just part and parcel of living in a modern major city.
Yeah. So that's what you're not going to do. But it takes it's going to take some real leadership there if they're going to move in this direction. And they should be looking at it from a strategic perspective and saying, listen, we've got to do a better job of information operations. We are looking like the bad guy. We are looking like the oppressor. We are looking like, and that's what they're looking like. And you need to actually do things so you don't look like that. And you can't just do propaganda. You actually have to do things and make that effort and go out there. And it is risky. This is what's scary. It's risky. There's no promise that just because you're carrying water into Gaza that you're not going to get blown up and killed. You can get blown up and killed carrying water into Gaza. No doubt about it. You know how many soldiers in Iraq got blown up on logistics convoys, on what we called med caps going out? Like, those things are going to happen. It's a risk, but those are the risks that you have to take in order to move in a direction that's going to put some kind of positivity on this. And, I thought kind of where you were going with at some point, the Palestinians, it's exactly what happened in Iraq, where the local populace starts saying, okay, I get it. The freaking insurgents are bad. They're bad. And they just want everyone to die. And the Americans, I heard a lot of bad things about them, but they gave us water. They are helping us with our, paving this road out here. They gave some medical treatment to my kid. They don't seem that bad as I thought. And the next thing you know, they realize that the Americans just want us to have a nice little city and be able to carry on, and a nice little country and be able to carry on. That takes a couple of generations, as I mentioned, because those beliefs run deep and you've been told a bunch of different things throughout your life. I mean, think about the re-education that is going to have to happen on both sides, right? To say, yeah, you know what? There's a reason that there's grievances. Oh, yeah, you know what? There's a reason that there's grievances. Both sides need to be saying that.
Yeah.
And
it goes to the information ops part of it that you're talking about too, because
I'm telling you, the information operations here this is the most strategic part of this whole campaign on both sides. Right now, Hamas is winning. Hamas has a more worldwide, the audience globally is more attuned to want to listen to Hamas. Does that have something to do with the fact that we've got this sort of culture of oppressor versus oppressed, and Hamas is putting themselves out there as the oppressed, and the global world right now thinks that oppressed people are the ones that need support. Of course, that's how we all got raised. That's what the freaking special forces, the Green Berets, their motto is liberate the oppressed, right? That's what their motto is. That's what they live for. So that's how we're raised. And we believe that the people that are oppressed are good. That's our thought. It's like, well, they're good. The oppressed people are good. The oppressors are bad, because why would oppressors oppress? They do that because they're bad. What we don't realize is that sometimes the oppressed are Nazis. Sometimes the oppressed are extremists that actually should be oppressed. Now, what happens in this situation, again, I liked out of the gate that there was some sort of differentiation between Hamas and Palestine. Hamas did a great job of making Hamas Palestinian. They are the Palestinian cause, as opposing to be a freaking terrorist cause. Because you've got to think a normal Palestinian person that's been living in Gaza is like, bro, you know what I want? A freaking job and water. That's what I want. I want my family, I want my kids to go to school. And to set them up, Hamas has done a great job of setting themselves up as the Palestinians.
And one of the reasons that they tend to win the information ops battle is that in a way they have an easier job, right? In the sense that Hamas, if world opinion turns against Hamas, that's actually fine. They're not really in any worse of a situation than they were before that. As long as the intensity of emotions and hatred and everything goes up, to prevent any fatal compromises, they're going to subvert their maximal gain, then that's good. As long as the level of intense emotions goes up. And that is easier to do.
Yeah.
You know, what you said too about, you know, the ones who may be oppressed, you can step back and look at this from a historical perspective and say, no doubt these people are oppressed. That does not, as much as we always sort of have interpreted it that way, does not make them the good guys.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, it's one thing Nietzsche had right. Yes, power can corrupt, but weakness and continual defeat can corrupt the soul as surely as anything. And that is something that I mean, there's no doubt that it's happened in Gaza to a large degree. It's not as bad in the West Bank, but, you know, I think I might have mentioned this in the last episode, but there have been independent journalists and stuff who've gone and taken polls of Palestinian schools and classrooms, little 12-year-old, 10-year-olds, and asked them, what do you want to do when you grow up? And something like 65 or 70% say, I want to be a martyr.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you know, well, everybody wants to climb the status ladder in their particular society. And in the context of that society, things have warped so much that is what kids aspire to. And it's like you said, that's a generational solution, if there's any solution.
If there is a solution. We got one more question, or are we good?
I think we're good. We're pushing up on 90 minutes. We'll get to some of these others again.
All right. Well, wish we had some more good news for you. Unfortunately, we don't. This is the way things are going. Check out our other podcasts. I have Jocko Podcast, the Warrior Kid Podcast, and Jocko Underground. Go to jockounderground.com. Darryl has his podcast called Martyr Made. Of course, to get the background, you know, he went through 15 minutes of history. He's got, how many hours is the first 6 episodes of Martyr Made?
I think maybe 27 or so.
If you want to hear a little more background, you can get 27 hours of it. His podcast is called Martyr Made. He also has a Substack, which is martyrmade.substack.com. And I've got some stuff that you can get at jockostore.com, jockofuel.com, originusa.com. And that's what we're doing. Also have a leadership consulting company where we teach people about leadership so you don't get caught in terrible situations. That's it for now. Thanks for listening as things really, unfortunately, start to unravel. This is Darryl and Jocko.